It's value chain I hate.
I won't mention value chain. So there are two value chains here.
The idea for this podcast came last year during the European Aviation Conference. And we have two speakers. One is Stef Proost, the other is Robert Malina. Stef was giving a Kunst lecture at the last European Aviation Conference in Antwerp. And this Kunst lecture was about aviation and especially also about the European Emission Trading Scheme. And Robert was part of a panel on also green policies. During this panel, there was a lot of discussion about ReFuel Aviation and SAF quota. So now the issue is how are they related? This is actually the topic of this podcast. We will have a few slide presentations right now, and we start with Stef.
It's a pleasure to talk about climate ambitions in aviation and ETS. I work really an aviation expert, but I work since 10 years on issues like air traffic control, SAF, what aviation policy makes sense for the EU. And that's what I'm going to try to talk about. Okay, whenever you discuss policy, you have to set it in a world context, because climate is in the end, it's a world public bad. A lot of things actually start with Paris 2015, where we got a much more ambitious climate agreement. But these climate agreements are nice, but given that it's an agreement between countries, it's not really enforceable. And this has important consequences. This means that if for local political reasons, it suits politicians better not to follow the agreement or to give a different interpretation, we will have some kind of stop and go. And that's actually what we see in the US. In the US, we have seen Obama signs, Trump withdraws, Biden re-enters Paris. Now Trump recently just also again withdraw from the Paris Agreement and encourages fossil production, scales back climate policy. I'm not sure whether the acts of the action in the US is that important for the global climate. I think it may be more important for the rest of the world, the other politicians looking at what the US is doing. And of course, if an important country with a lot of technology is not pursuing the road to the Paris Agreement, okay, that's discouraging for all the other countries. Okay, of course, we have China, limited climate policy, with strong industrial policy component. We'll come back to orders of magnitude for permits, taxes, but they really invested a lot in photovoltaics, electric cars, wind power, mainly to make sure that this will become an important industry within China, but also export industry. Now, finally, we have the EU, which is the strongest, most consistent climate policy. Of course, they will also be stressed are forced to stress industrial policy component, all kind of instruments that we will not dwell about. And it may scale back somewhat the climate emissions in the short term. Now, this is actually some kind of background. Aviation is not formally part of the Paris Agreement. Other agreements like CORSIA exist, but there the policy commitments are not streamlined. So what we see in terms of aviation is still kind of mainly EU-driven, and the other countries are interested. They may be interested to start some policy, but all that is a little bit more vague than in the case of, let's say, land-based emissions. Okay. There are two main policy lines in So we have to distinguish between intra-EU aviation and all the aviation trips outside the EU. Outside the EU, things are not yet that clear. But for all aviation within the EU, we have a very clear commitment or very clear policy line at the European Union. And the first instrument that has been used since, let's say, 2010 or 2012, is to ask aviation sector for all flights within EU to participate in the ETS emission permit system. The second line is that may become more important, will be discussed by Robert Malina, is to make sure that the fuels need also to become cleaner. The use of sustainable aviation fuels, things like that, that can at least partially substitute the system of ETS permits. Okay, here you see the emissions of the EU, total emissions of CO2 in Europe. And they promised to go to net zero in 2050. Note the net zero. The net zero still means that you can still have positive CO2 emissions in 2050, as long as that they are compensated by negative emissions in different ways. Okay, so carbon removal technologies enter the line here. Okay, so you see that transport is an important component. Actually, aviation is only a very small part of this transport. We're talking maybe 5% less. Now, for me, the ETS system remains the crucial policy instrument. Now, what is this ETS system? ETS system is actually a global cap bubble for emissions of three sectors: electricity generation, industry, and intra-EU aviation. Okay, and this bubble, this global cap, will progressively go to net zero in 2050. A lot of people say, yeah, this is just accounting trick. I've been teaching this to engineers, and the first reaction is, yes, you know, a plane, you see what's coming out is burning kerosene, so that's CO2. Don't forget this, and you cannot. You can do some accounting, etc. No, I say no, it's not true. It's not only, of course, you need an accounting system, but it's also a real gap. You will see that every year the total emissions of CO2 for these three sectors has to go down, and aviation is included in there. Okay. Now, emission permits, you can handle them in different ways. Initially, they are partly grandfathered in most of the sectors, so this means distributed for free in function of past emissions. Important is also that these emission permits are tradable among sectors. They are also bankable. They can be used in later periods. And the result will be that those that have lower abatement cost will sell their abatement permits to those that have higher abatement cost. And this means that in the end, you have one price for a ton of CO2, and that guarantees, that's according to economists, and it's something you can show, that guarantees that you minimize total abatement costs for these three sectors. Okay. It's important to realize that this is actually a demonstration that that industry knows better than the government. Very often when the government imposes some measures, they don't know exactly what are the costs. Industry very often knows better. And it's not only in aesthetic sense, also in dynamic sense, the industry will think about what we can do to make sure that we can reduce emissions in the future, that we can do it in a cheaper way than we have to do it now. Okay. That's actually the cap that is going down until 2050. And how does it go down? It goes down by always setting less and less permits in the market. Okay, unfortunately, this is not very well understood. I've regularly discussions with people of industry, people, politicians that are in the field. And the typical question is, if I substitute an airline trip in the EU by a rail journey, if I want to go to Barcelona, from Brussels to Barcelona, normally I fly there, but if I substitute it by a rail journey, does it make any difference for total CO2 emissions in the EU? And the answer is no. So unfortunately, we still see a lot of policy discussions that just do not understand this rather elementary element. I agree that there may be other reasons to substitute a flight by rail journey, but then we are discussing other greenhouse gases that have to do with contrails, and that's a slightly different discussion on which we can also dwell if necessary. Okay, this gives you an idea of the prices of a ton of CO2. So these prices give you an idea about what is the marginal abatement cost. What is the cost of reducing CO2 in these three sectors? So the upper curve is the curve for the EU. The other curves are curves for other countries, as here, Korean, New Zealand, California, China. And to judge on, if you can judge the world on the basis of these prices, you see that the ambitions in the EU are still lie much higher than than in the rest of the world. Okay. Next step is the next question is people say, does it work for aviation? There are several empirical empirical validations, okay, where actually, for instance, I mentioned here Fageda and Tuxedo, a nice paper, very straightforward, where they say we have flights that are under ETS, so within the EU, and they compare for similar aviation technology, those flights with flights to outside the EU, but at more or less the same distance. And they show also what is outside the EU is flying in the past, it was flying to Eastern Europe, or countries that were not part of the ETS system. And they demonstrated that it worked, even if you distribute the permits for free. If you distribute permits for free, the permits can still be sold to other emitters, and so they have an opportunity cost. They also found that the effect is larger for routes where an alternative, in this case rail, exists. Okay, what happens is that the cost of fuel goes up because you also need to buy some permits. If the cost of fuel goes up, of course, if you have a route on which there is an alternative, people will more easily switch to the alternative. You also see a larger effect on the low-cost airlines. So EasyJet and Ryanair very often get a bad press because they're responsible for very low prices for air trips. But that's true. On the other hand, they are the ones that react most vigorously to any increase in the prices of fuel. And that's the reason why you see this larger effect.
I have a few comments and questions. There is one issue which I think is important, which is the mentioning of these non-CO2 emissions. I think it is important to highlight that they are not yet part of this EU ETS system. And there is a lot of uncertainty, as my understanding, and I think Robert will know much better about that. There's a lot of uncertainty towards, what is the order of magnitude in terms of their climate impact. But there are some indications, to my understanding, that say that could be even higher than the greenhouse gas emissions. Is that correct, Robert?
Well, so I mean, we have non-CO2 effects and we have CO2 effects, right? That together form the climate impact of aviation. And from the CO2 impacts, usually we use a number, I think 2.5 to 3% of global anthropogenic CO2 emissions attributable to aviation. And then you add, primarily the persistent warming contrails impact to it. And then, I think a mean estimate is around 4% taken together. So there is indeed a markup on top of the CO2 impact that has to be accounted for. It is uncertain, but I think that the evidence that there is a markup is that's not disputed anymore.
I see. I think this is something, and this is not covered by the EU ETS, right? And this is, but I heard at least that there are some ideas about some people thinking about how this possibly could be added to the EU ETS system, but I don't know how far we are with this.
Well, on the aviation side, if I may, the first step is the monitoring side, right? And that's where the EU has established a framework for monitoring, reporting, and verification of these non-CO2 emissions from aviation. That is now being rolled out. We have to see how that works. And then based on this, right, the data that is being available, the next step would be to see how this could be implemented in a policy framework.
Right.
So that first step is important, and it seems a bit ridiculous that we are at that first step only, but the EU is actually the first regulatory, first region of the world where we actually have this monitoring of non-CO2 impacts from aviation being implemented.
Right. So, and then, Stef, something else you mentioned, which is this bankability. And some people may be wondering, does this...
Can I come back to this?
Sorry, please go ahead.
Is that okay? Okay. So I was in a workshop dedicated to this non-CO2 in The Hague recently. Where actually, the Dutch are very, very active on that field, at least on aviation. They just have a lot of manpower working on that. And it looks like, first of all, depends very much on local conditions. And in Europe, everything which is flying more direction Scandinavia can have much more than this, can have a markup in terms of importance, much more than 50%. It could be 10 times as important as a CO2 emission. So it's very important to know where you're flying and in what period. On the other hand, so what is interesting too is that actually, on the one hand, in the aviation sector, there's software coming that allows aircrafts to predict more or less where are the regions that where they should stay away. What is the alternative route? And taking alternative route very often means a little bit more carbon. But if you can reduce the non-CO2 emissions a lot, that is actually pretty important. What is necessary for that is not only that the aviation sector knows it, but also there is good monitoring. And for the monitoring, I always count on air traffic control, where I think in Europe we have a lot of slack. There's much more that can be done in terms of monitoring. CO2 emissions and the non-CO2 gases. And there, I think Europe could take some action. I think it's, since 10 years, we're discussing how to make this sector more cost efficient, more efficient, and we're just not making a lot of progress. So I think for me, once you have good monitoring, you could add that in theory, you could add it as some kind of equivalent to ETS, which involves a discussion on, let's say, how long these different types of emissions are active, etc. There's still a discussion, but I think I see some clear possibilities for progress on that side. But I don't know, Robert, whether that is discussed in your committees or.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a shift in the last couple of years from the CO2 to the non-CO2 effects, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because we've started implementing policies that target the CO2 emissions of aviation, but as the science evolves on the non-CO2 effects, one does realize that these are probably as important as the CO2 effects. It's a difficult topic in the sense that they are spatially and temporally heterogeneous. The CO2 effects are simply a function of the fuel burn and the fuel that you use, right? Ultimately, it does not matter where it's being emitted and at which time it's being emitted. But for the non-CO2 effects, meteorology, location, seasonality, all of this plays a big role. But that's why the monitoring is such an important step that is now being implemented in the European Union.
And you mean for monitoring is mainly air traffic control? Is that the major, because I see monitoring, you can ask, of course, we should not ask the aviation sector. We have some kind of independent body that has to follow up and monitor the system. And is it air traffic control that has to do it? Or in theory, they have a function there, but.
Yeah, I'm sure they have a function. Whether they can take over the full monitoring themselves, I am not sure. But I think that's also what the MRV approach that's being rolled out in the EU is now trying to find out, right? How do we do this? At which part of the value chain of aviation is it the most efficient or the most effective? I have no answer for this at this point, but I think in a couple of years we will know more.
Okay, very good.
All right, good. So
Sorry.
I think another is that are you?
That's what I can as well share that, and there's an opportunity to discuss these issues now. Okay, so I'm fine. I'm done.
All right, good. So I think it's something else. I think it's pretty clear, and perhaps we don't need a long discussion for this, but I think it is important to highlight that this grandfathering does not have an impact on the environment, so to say. So you have a given number of certificates, and the way they are allocated to the different stakeholders doesn't matter for the environment. I think this is also something that is important to highlight. So the very fact that especially in the beginning, airlines got a lot of those certificates for free, basically the environmental effect of giving them for free is zero. It only depends on the total number of certificates, the environmental effect. I think that is just something that is important to just clarify. And
it has an opportunity because it can be sold. That's always the reason it can be sold to other parties. So it has a value. And that's because it has a value, it still makes sense to try not to use too much the permits you received. But for an economist, it's obvious, but not for everybody. So it needs to be repeated indeed. needs to be discussed, and yeah, very often to go through different steps to show that it really works like this. And of
Yeah,
course,
I think this is the reason why I thought it would be, you know, worthwhile highlighting this one more time, that
yeah,
as you mentioned, as long as this is tradable, whether you get it for free or not, you know, if you use it, then you can't sell it. So you have basically, in that sense, you have a loss. No matter whether you have received it for free or we have to pay for it. Obviously, if you have to pay for a certificate, then you also have some cost. But if you use it, if you have obtained it for free, and then you use it yourself and don't sell it, you also have a loss here. So and the environmental effect is just the same. So then there's
Achim, if I may,
Sure, Robert.
just follow up on this. So what the industry argues here, and I do not know if it's true, is that you have like second order indirect effects from the allocation rule. So if you have the argument I've heard before is that if you make airlines pay for the allowances, the cash base is lower, and their ability to invest into new aircraft is smaller, delaying fleet renewal into the future, and therefore, yeah, increasing emissions beyond what would be possible for them to achieve if they had more cash in order to invest into new aircraft. So these are the secondary effects. But I do not know empirically to which extent anybody has looked into this. But that's the argument that they make. Just from a financial background, I do understand this, right? Because the cash involved in these two allocation rules or regimes does differ drastically.
Well, I mean, actually, it's very interesting that you bring this up, because this has been a big discussion among between Stef and myself, and yeah, I've been working I've been working on this, and I would say I don't actually. My starting point was exactly the point that you have just made, and I just wanted to find some evidence for this. Theoretically, it's very difficult, I would say. But that's, I think I don't want to go into I could now talk about this for quite a while, but that would be going a little bit beyond what we would be discussing here. So I would say I hear that point. I also feel somehow it is convincing, but I don't, based on the research that I've done, I would say I don't follow this argument. Anything from your side, Stef?
Well, I would say, yeah, in principle, if you have in economics a well-functioning financial market, then if you have opportunity to invest in cleaner aircraft, the cleaner aircraft will be, if it's more cost effective, including the prices of carbon permits, it will be done. So for me, you have to look for market imperfections to show that this becomes relevant. Of course, many industries prefer not to pay for their permits. That's a normal response from their side. But up to now, it has been very difficult to demonstrate. I've seen almost no economic papers that could make the case that that grandfathering is as such, or grandfathering or selling, whether that makes a difference in terms of environmental outcome. But okay. I agree that it's my opinion.
No, I think this is an important another important point. When it comes to, I also thought it's worthwhile mentioning why bankability makes sense, because the climate effect depends on your cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. So it doesn't really, the long-term effect doesn't really matter whether you emit the greenhouse gases in 2026 or in 2027, because ultimately it's the cumulative effects that matter. So in this sense, you know, having a banking system. So if you haven't used your certificates now and you don't want to sell it because you feel the prices are too low and you want to you better keep the certificates for the future. As long as we don't talk about, like, say, 100 years or so, which I don't think is the relevant time frame, then you know, I think this makes total sense based on the physics. Is this the right word? The physics of you know, how climate emissions are affecting the greenhouse gas emission affecting the climate.
The bankable aspect is actually two important issues, two important dimensions. First of all, the bankability allows the market to operate more easily. Okay, so you have a stock, and that's it gives you indeed some opportunities to postpone or to advance some of your. It's also this bankability also allows you to give special incentives for new technologies. The only minor point with this bankability is that there's been an issue of too many permits at some time, at some period, let's say a few years ago. And now the Commission has set up a system for stabilizing emissions, that whenever there are too many emissions on the market, they can destroy part of the emissions. So this bankability, if there are too many permits that are not used now, you add to the total amount of permits that is in the system, that automatically puts in motion some correction mechanisms, which are pretty complicated. And so that makes it a little bit, let's say, bankability. That's one of the issues about bankability. That should not be forgotten. Let's put it this way. I usually don't mention it too much, because then people get completely, then you get lost in
right, but I think the big picture, is basically it's the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions that matter for the climate.
That matters, of course.
That is, I think this is, I feel like a good justification for having such a thing as bankability. Is there something would you want to say something?
No, I'm gonna stop.
All right. Okay. So the another issue is, I think it is worthwhile highlighting in your picture, which you showed the lines of the ETS, you know, emission trading scheme prices, that there were few lines, and that one of the lines actually is China, and there are some missing, such as the US, for instance. And I think this is just something that is worthwhile mentioning, that such a scheme as a European emission trading scheme is not very common across the globe. So, but I think it's a good policy, and we should help promote the use of emission trading schemes elsewhere.
As you know, to add a small point to that, European Commission is also trying to encourage other countries to use the same system. And it's also, there are still talks about trying to trade, so try to have common permits for several continents. And we made some mistakes in the past. Let's say, I think in the Kyoto Agreement, we agreed with Russia at certain point that they were allowed certain emissions. They could then be traded, but in the end, so it came down to a lot of hot air. So we gave them a lot of emissions, which they can sell to the rest of the world, or they can negotiate trade with the rest of the world. But in the end, we gave them way too much. because their industry was anyway, industrial activity was decreasing a lot. So it was based on old data, not on good. But I guess the Commission will come back with these ideas and will try to set up common systems with maybe India, South Africa, or other countries. So the system is, I think, working. It also be generalized to other sectors, like the other transport sectors, like the use of cars, the use of trucks, also residential energy use. Here, I'm a little bit reluctant to say it's a good move, because we have so many different taxation regimes for these sectors that in the end, it's difficult to come up with an efficient system if countries are not ready to reduce their current taxes. Let's say, for instance, to example, in the Netherlands, you pay natural gas, twice as much as in Belgium. And the main reason is that there's a very high kind of tax, implicit tax in the Netherlands. We don't have that. And then you say, okay, now we're going to add another system to that. No. Then we're making mistakes, because we're adding permit systems on top of taxation systems. And then you're not coming with doing your own.
Actually, this is a kind of similar to the problem, the main problem of this podcast, which is also we have different policies and how do they interact with each other, right? I think this is
no, that's true. So there's a problem there, and it's not yet settled. In principle, the countries could say countries are allowed to reduce their taxes, existing taxes, but in theory, it could also be done for gasoline. You know, if you a liter of gasoline, 2/3 of the liter of the price of gasoline consists of taxes. I don't see a lot of European countries reducing their taxes on gasoline. So, and to see it replaced by something else, it will be, in policy terms, will be difficult to get it right. But it's okay. A small side step.
There's one other, I think, which is very interesting, one point, because you mentioned the study by Fajeda and Teixedo. I think this is the way perhaps to pronounce them, because it should be Catalan. And so maybe you can show us the slides, because what you were writing, and I would be, of course it's a great paper. But basically what you wrote is that you say it works because they reduce emissions. Now, I would say, let's say they would have found that adding aviation to the ETS has not reduced aviation emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions associated with flying or with the aviation industry. Would that mean that the EU ETS is not working?
No, I say it's working for aviation. What the study shows is that if you compare routes on which ETS, let's say, applies, and similar routes using similar technology where actually it does not apply, you see that in the regions or in the areas where ETS is applied, we will see a net effect in terms of reduction of frequency, reduction of the number of flights in these regions compared to the non-treated regions. So I think in terms of econometrics, for me, it's a nice demonstration.
Yeah, I don't question this. The only thing I would like to say is that what would be my test for the emission permit, the EU ETS working? For me, there's only one test, and this is, do they effectively cap the total emissions? And if that's true, it's working. It doesn't matter whether the introducing the EU ETS leads to reductions in some sector or not in reduction, or perhaps increases in emissions in other sectors. The only thing that matters, and I learned this from you, okay, or this is why I'm highlighting this, because I feel here, even if we would have found, or if not we, but our good friends and colleagues, Xavi and his co-author, even if they would have found that aviation is resistant and doesn't do anything, it wouldn't mean that the ETS system doesn't work, because
okay,
yeah, it's just something that I thought is, in the light of what we are discussing right now, that this is kind of worthwhile mentioning.
Yeah, so actually I should write down they reduce emissions compared to the non-controlled zones. That's what you see. And of course, it could still be that total emissions go up in the aviation sector. I have no problem with that. But we see that there's actually a price for emissions, a price for permits that works and decreases the growth or decreases comparatively emissions in the ETS zones compared to the non-ETS zone.
Right. And I think that the point is, yeah, I think it's just important to, given since this is one of the main points that we are trying to make here, that the success of the ETS system does not depend on whether one sector reduces emissions or not. It's really the total emissions that matter. And this is true for all sectors, including the aviation sector. So I think this is something that worthwhile highlighting, because I think this is also one of the points that I think you're always making and highlighting, and this is why I can be actually quite sensitive with respect to such points, and I found that interesting, that that could be applied to the assessment of of those study results, so to say.
Yeah. Okay, so I should mention it a bit better compared to the other zones,
but even if compared to the other zones, aviation would, for whatever reason, have increased, there could be a drastic increase in the demand, more than in other sectors, for instance, so that aviation uses more certificates rather than fewer certificates than other industries. It would still not mean that the ETS is not working. It's still working, because it doesn't matter whether aviation is increasing their emissions, because the only thing that matters is that it's the total emissions. It's if aviation uses more certificates, that means that other sectors would have to use less, so that the total emissions are unchanged. And so the very fact that this, the sectors, that's the point of this ETS system. It's that there is this flexibility. We don't impose that on a certain industry that they should be doing certain things, because maybe they shouldn't. Maybe because they have such a high demand, they should be using more certificates, whereas other industries that have maybe lower demands are becoming less attractive for users, for consumers. They're using less, and it's fine. This is what this system allows to happen, and therefore, just the very fact that it has some impact is kind of I feel is not a very good indicator for the success of the system, because the only way the success can be judged is by the ability to cap the total emissions. As long as this is happening, ETS is successful. This is what I think is important to highlight.
Achim, just adding to this. So what I find interesting about this paper by Fajeda and his colleague is actually that we see a reaction of the sector to being included in EU ETS. So that's not the element of effectiveness of the system. This is a hard to abate sector, right? Where our premise always is that it's probably cheaper to just buy the permits and not reduce emissions and have other sectors abate the emissions. And to some extent that is happening, but to some extent, actually we see that there are segments of the market apparently where it is cheaper for an airline to reduce the emissions than just buying the permits from somewhere else. So that's more how I see the paper. So when we talk about this, I don't know, 4.7% reduction in emissions compared to the area that is, yeah, I think they use this difference in difference approach, right? So
Yes.
the essentially like I don't know the counterfactual, the 4.7%. That's what for me what's interesting, because it shows how to abate, yes, but not everywhere. Right? There are these pockets where it does make sense economically for an airline to reduce emissions under the EU ETS. That's why I found this paper interesting in particular, actually.
Well, I'm not questioning. I mean, obviously, this is a very useful exercise. And we know that there must be some responses from the industry, but we don't know where it should be happening. And it's difficult for policymakers to know in advance. And this is where actually this is one of the strengths of such market mechanisms, is that we don't need that, and we give the flexibility to the industry, and so that we can take advantage of the current conditions, and so that the emissions can be reduced where they can be reduced at the lowest efforts in a sense. And in this case, it seems that reducing aviation where there is competition with rail, for instance. This is a relatively cheap way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Why is that? Well, there's a competition with the rail, the margins are lower, so then it's not worthwhile paying the certificate price, right? So it makes sense. But perhaps, then overall for the aviation industry, the success of the system should not be just based on whether the ETS makes aviation increase or reduce the use of certificates. The only thing that matters is really the total number of certificates. And I highlight this. This is something that I learned from all my discussions with Stef, and I think this is a very good comment and paper or opportunity to make that point again.
Okay.
How about Robert? How about we move to your presentation right now?
So we're switching now to another policy, and that's the ReFuelEU SAF mandate. SAF is a topic that has kept me busy research-wise now for quite a while. So I initially also come more from the air transport economic side. But for 15 years now, actually focused on aviation and the environment, and then in particular, sustainable aviation fuels. And I wanted to actually start by showing this slide here, that actually is from ATAC, the Air Transport Action Group, that is the organization of the air transport industry that deals with especially with environmental matters. So it's ACI and IATA predominantly involved. And that's a decarbonization roadmap for aviation out to 2050. Many different organizations have such a roadmap. We've been involved in developing the one for ICAO, for example, for the long-term aspirational goal. But no matter which roadmap you look at, you will always see that sustainable aviation fuels are supposed to be the most important lever to getting to net zero CO2 by 2050. So in this specific example, it's roughly 70% of the emission reduction coming from this SAF, right? And that is because depending on the type of SAF you use, they have life cycle emission benefits, and there is the assumption that SAF can be scaled up faster than, for example, new aircraft could disseminate through the fleet, right? Or whether it is like electric aviation for regional, or maybe hydrogen, right? For long haul, right? If they happen, it will take a long time until the airlines actually have taken this up, and the full benefit across the fleet is there, given that these aircraft have to be flown for 20, 30 years, right? Whereas SAF, well, you build a SAF refinery, right? And you can use it as a drop-in fuel in your aircraft engine. So that's a bit the expectation that it lies behind these values, right? And some other roadmaps maybe do say 60%, and some other roadmaps say 80%. But wherever you look, SAF is the most important lever for aviation decarbonization. But if you look at the use at this point, so global jet fuel usage is roughly 330 million tons a year. And last year, for the first time, we've reached the 1 million ton mark for SAF. That in a way was quite an accomplishment. Was significantly more than in 2023. But it is literally a tiny dot at this point, right? There's still a long way to go in order to get to these large volumes that are needed to even getting close to the net zero CO2 ambition that I've shown before. Well, why is usage low? Many reasons. Many of these reasons translate into one number, that is the price of SAF. So EASA published, I think in December last year, for the first time, a state of SAF report for the European Union. That's some interesting price data in there. So what you need to look here actually is what is called the CAF baseline. CAF is lingo for conventional aviation fuel, so petroleum-derived aviation fuel. The average in the EU, average cost was 816 euro in 2023. And then in the middle, what EASA calls the aviation biofuels actual 2023 price. That's the SAF price in the market in the EU. And that is 3 times as high, right, as the conventional jet fuel price. So it's at this point just very expensive. So that means in order to get an airline to use SAF, something has to happen, right? You can use the stick or you can use the carrot in order to do this. And across the globe, we see different approaches for this. Often it's a mix, and what I'm mentioning now is a bit simplified. But in the US, under Biden, I should say now, it was clearly the carrot, right? Large subsidies being given out for SAF facilities, with the idea that drives down then the price that the airlines have to pay for using SAF. And in the EU, again, bit simplified, we have the stick, because obviously we also have incentive mechanisms in place, but there is a SAF quota that has now been implemented. There are also other countries that are doing similar policies. The UK is having a SAF mandate. Countries such as Japan are looking into SAF mandates. Indonesia, Brazil, I think it just went through parliament there. So it's not that the EU is the only region that uses a stick, but we certainly have a stick, and that stick is the ReFuelEU mandate. Stef was alluding to the mandate. So it actually kicked in the beginning of this year, relatively moderate volume. So 2% of fuel uplift at union airports has to be neat SAF. And then there is an ever increasing share out to 2050. 2050 will be 70%. That's supposed to be SAF. There's a sub mandate for synthetic aviation fuel. So that's power to liquid eSAFs. And kicks in 2030 with 1.2% blend mandate, and then also aggressively increases. What's important here is that this is an uplift mandate. So it is agnostic to where the fuel is being used. So the EU ETS is for intra-EU flights at this point. The ReFuelEU mandate is for fuel usage, for fuel uplift at European airports. So it doesn't matter where the flight goes to. On average, this percentage has to be on board, right? Obviously, across the sector, across a year. And I think that's relevant, right? Because that is the EU ETS an EU intra-EU policy at this point because of resistance of several countries outside the EU to extend it to all flights leaving or arriving at EU airports. But the ReFuelEU mandate is an uplift mandate. So again, agnostic to where the fuel is going to. So what we were curious about, and that's something that we track now for many years, is actually, well, how much SAF is in the market and how much SAF might be in the market in the next couple of years. So can we fulfill this mandate? What is the situation globally? What's the difference between what's being announced? Because there are a lot of announcements, right? When I go to LinkedIn, there's not a single day where there's not some fantastic story about a SAF facility being announced to happen at an unspecified time in the future at a certain location. But there is often a discrepancy between what's being announced and what is being in the market. And I want to show some data actually on this. And I'll start with the European data. So might not be the easiest of all slides that we've ever produced. So let me explain what I'm trying to show here. So let's focus on the left side. This is realized capacity and expected future capacity out to 2030. So everything there in gray with the black dots, that is capacity that is in the market. And then these colorful lines are what has been announced at a certain time to be in the market in a certain year. And so the most recent announcement, that's the top line, which are announced by 2024. There is a spread that has something to do with the fact that if you have a biorefinery, you can produce different products, right? You can produce SAF, you can also produce renewable diesel, and the ultimate product slate will depend on the market conditions at a certain point in time. So we do not know exactly how much SAF will be produced. So there is a range. That's where it's coming from. And if you just look at these values, and again look at the top line here, and compare it with the EU mandate that I'll see if you can see my cursor here, right, for 2030, then it looks like everything is fine, right? Because we might need 2.8 million tons by 2030 in Europe. And you see the announcements at this point for production in 2030 are on the order of 8 million tons. So it's much more than what is needed. But the picture actually is much more nuanced. And the picture is much more nuanced if you look at what we call a realization gap. So what is the difference between what was announced to be in the market by now and what is actually in the market by now? So we can only do that obviously for 2024 and earlier years because we do not know what actually will be produced in the future. But we do know that just based on the most recent data for 2024, that we already have a realization gap of 2 million tons. Roughly capacity in the EU 0.5 million tons by the end of 2024. Not everything, the capacity is not fully used, right? But the capacity that's out there to produce SAF. And what should have been in there was more than 2 million tons. So there's a big gap between what is being announced and what is actually being produced. So only 26% of the European capacity that was supposed to be in the market by the end of 2024, based on what companies have announced, has actually entered the market by now, and that's concerning in a way. It's not really surprising because it's a novel industry. I mean, you will see it in one of the subsequent slides. Most of the technologies at this point in the market, that's either co-processing or hydroprocess ester and fatty acids, which are the most mature ones. So it's also not rocket science, but these are still technologies that have to be tried out at scale. There are kinks to be worked out. So it's not a surprise that not all the capacity that has been announced is entering the market, but it's still concerning. That's the European story. Just briefly, the global data is exactly the same picture, just bigger. The problem is bigger because it's the global market, right? So there are also roughly 26% of the announced capacity that should be in the market by now is in the market by now, and 3/4 have not happened yet. So I want to show, this is done for the global data, well, what has happened to these projects? In which stage are they? So expected capacity by the end of 2024, just based on announcements, was roughly 8.5 million tons. And you see roughly 30% of the projects that were announced have failed by now. So the companies are either bankrupt or the projects have stopped. The company still exists, right? But the plant will not be built. Roughly 1/4 is realized, that's the green part. And then roughly 50% are delayed, right? Some of them are under construction. Some of them are awaiting final investment decision. And many of them are actually still in the feasibility stage also, right? Which is then quite a big delay because they should have been built by now and be operated. We can show the data also, look at the data in terms of the technologies. I mentioned HEFA and co-processing are dominant. You see it here as well. So virtually everything that is in the market by the end of 2024 is either HEFA or it's co-processing. So co-processing means you have a biofeed that goes into a conventional petroleum refinery, and then part of your total product slate is the biofeed, and you can sell that as SAF. It's very common actually in the European Union to do that. We are co-processing. It's much less common in the US. So this was my last slide. The point I'm trying to make here is that we have this policy in place in Europe and in some other countries that is essentially a SAF quota. If you look at the announcements that are out there, it seems like we are on track to fulfilling these quotas. But there is a big discrepancy between what is being announced and what actually enters the market.
Right. And I think now we're reaching the point, we are getting to the main point of this whole discussion, because that is something that we touched during the European Aviation Conference, and I think it's worthwhile having a little bit more detailed discussion, is about, okay, so now we see that there is this, there's this realization gap. I think no matter who you are talking to, everybody will be, whenever we talk about future SAF goals, people will say it's very expensive, investments are very uncertain. We see, for instance, now the policy changes in the US, and that is certainly not helping with the, for useful. This is not something appreciated, let's put it this way, by investors. And now there's this realization gap. Now, what will be so let's say we cannot close the gap. What will be the environmental effect of not closing the gap? And then there is as a starting point of a discussion, if we think about the Europe and say, okay, the total emissions are determined by the number of certificates given associated with the European Emission Trading Scheme, and if it means that if we use less SAF because there is this realization gap which has not been closed, then it means that other sectors that means that aviation will have to use more certificates, will have to buy them from other sectors, so the greenhouse gas emissions have to be reduced somewhere else, but the total emissions wouldn't be changing. I don't think it's okay. So I think this is just the starting point of the discussion. But I don't think it's the end of that's not the whole story. But I think Robert, I'm sure you have something to say about that.
Yeah, well, my initial answer is it's complicated, right? So let's look at this maybe purely from the emission perspective, right? My understanding is under the EU ETS, right? As the flights under the EU ETS, whether an airline uses SAF or not for an intra-EU flight ultimately has no impact on the total emissions in Europe because we have the cap, right? There should be no impact. The argument we heard before, right, that Stef brought applies here as well, right? It's absolutely the same. But the coverage obviously is different, right? I was trying to find some data on what's fuel burn for flights outside of Europe compared to flights within Europe. Surprisingly difficult, but I think it's fair to say will be something on the order of half of total fuel burn, right? Like, well, maybe it's 40, maybe it's 60%, but it's definitely substantial, right? It's definitely a substantial share of fuel uplift at European airport that goes to destinations outside of Europe, right? And that's where we have limited policies in place, right? We have the CORSIA system, right, that applies to these flights. But CORSIA is a policy, first of all, only goes out to 2035, and second, has just a moderate emission reduction baked in. It's 85% of the pre-COVID baseline, right? That's the emissions that are being allowed, and then you can also do these offsets, right, to make up for this, or SAF. So there's not really a super stringent policy in place at this point. I think that's fair to say. So I would argue it is in particular important to make sure that there are emission reduction for the flights that go outside of the European Union or are completely outside of the European Union. And I think that will be a challenge. I mean, I showed data, right, on the green premium, which is essentially a factor 2.5 now, conventional aviation fuel versus SAF. That is a big hit for airlines. And again, in the EU, has to be uplifted, but
with other, green premium, you mean the higher fuel prices? So SAF
the higher fuel prices. Yeah, we call this green premium. Maybe okay. that's environmental greenwashing, right? But it's the idea of, well, you have these fuels. Many of these fuels have lower life cycle emissions. They're not zero carbon, right? But they have lower life cycle greenhouse gas emissions than conventional jet fuel, but they are more expensive, right? And that is then the green premium. So in the absence of either a policy such as in the US under Biden that drives down the price that airlines have to pay for SAF, or a effective stick as in the European Union, well, it will be difficult to convince airlines to use SAF, right? Given that green premium, the big difference in prices.
I think this puts the whole policy into a little bit different. It puts a different perspective on it, I would say, because I think the main environmental effect that we can get from the SAF quota is actually by having reaching a broader set of passengers which are not covered by the EU ETS. I was also looking for some orders of magnitude, and I think it was, I got some numbers on air passenger transport by type of transport in the EU in 2023, and that is published by Eurostat, and it's basically half-half. So one half is extra EU, but it's passenger, right? It's not fuel burn, because, you know, we have to correct for the average distance of the flights, and perhaps extra EU would be longer distances. So that actually means that, yes. So the main environmental effect, actually, of the SAF quota is because they apply to a larger set of passengers. If that would only be for EU passengers, it would basically, the realization gap wouldn't be a environmental concern. It is an environmental concern because, but then actually now there is another perhaps thought here. If that's the case, actually it would predominate, because we have the realization gap. There is not enough SAF available. So it would actually be better to use as much SAF as possible for extra EU flights, because for intra-EU flight, it doesn't matter, right? So I think this is actually puts a little bit of a different perspective on this whole policy design. I don't know whether this can be done, because there could be some discrimination things happening here. But still, I think it's important to know that this realization gap, how this transfers into more emissions, that is somehow limited by the existence of the EU ETS, although the gap still covers a relatively substantial part.
Yeah, can I come back in?
Sure.
Okay. Now, okay, for everything which is, I agree that it's important to also look at flights outside the EU, but there, in principle, like also within the EU, ultimately, I think you can count on carbon capture. And carbon capture, if you look at these technologies, they're actually, if you think about orders of magnitude of 200 or 300 euro per ton of CO2 captured, I think that is cheaper than these SAF that are based on hydrogen and CO2 capture. So what you actually do is you make a fuel for aviation by capturing CO2, putting it together with hydrogen, and these two technologies are very costly. It could be that it could be beaten by just continue to use kerosene, but compensate the kerosene by just capturing CO2. That will be my first point in whenever you think about this issue of making carbon-free fuels. Second point is that actually in CORSIA, there is also the option to use other ways of compensating emissions than just SAF. In CORSIA, there is also an option to use but they're offsets. Now, I know offsets is kind of dangerous. They need the right qualifications. You need to know that it are really additional. But I think in the state of climate policy in most of the world, there's certainly still options where you can do it at relatively low cost. That would be my second point. My third point is actually, if you look, like Robert said, that this capacity is simply not coming, it's not realized. Of course, if people have two comments on that. First of all, we have been trying biofuel for cars and trucks, maybe 15 years. With, again, sometimes enormous subsidies, because these biofuels were often not taxed. So this means a 200% subsidy. I'm not convinced that technological progress will come quickly and make sure that these costs will go down. Now, I think industry is very often smarter than government. They will start to see that this may not be sustainable in the sense economically, and that the governments will just come back to their return and scale down the policies on SAFs. And I think they're anticipating that and say, okay, rather than to make investments where actually the return is not guaranteed, because I'm not sure that the airlines or the political world is ready to accept fuels that are 5 or 6 times more expensive. They will if they realize this, they will say, okay, I will just not do the investment. And I'm afraid that that is what is going on now. But okay, it's my interpretation. It's kind of.
No one knows. No one knows.
No,
But I
you,
would say I'm worried that I cut Robert right now. Did you
Sorry, yeah, Robert.
did you want to respond, Robert? Did you have something?
Yeah, well, I agree about the size of the challenge. I wanted to come back, Achim, to what you said previously, though, also about the need is that we essentially would have needed a mandate that focuses on extra EU traffic, because we already have the EU ETS in place, and every unit of SAF that is used for intra-EU traffic does not lead to emission reduction. And I agree with that. The reality is, though, that the different policies that we have in place, they work exactly the other way around. Because so we have the EU ETS. If you use SAF in the EU ETS, it's assumed to be 0 CO2. So that means every ton.
Although it's not.
Although it's
under
not.
the current
although
production.
it's not. Yeah. Although it's not. So it's even like you get a multiplier, right? You get an extra benefit.
You get an extra. Exactly.
Yeah. So and that is actually important, right? That is a big financial gain or mitigation measure, right, for using SAF within the European Union, right? And so you have the uplift mandate, right? Again, agnostic, right? But then how an airline uses it, where it puts the SAF, right, is driven again by the economics. So intra-EU, you have the net zero or the 0 CO2 rating of a SAF, but internationally, CORSIA applies, right? And for CORSIA, as Stef rightly pointed out, the trade-off that an airline faces is it can use the expensive SAF or it can use a cheap offset, right? If it uses the expensive SAF, it actually only wins the costs of the avoided offsets, but they are super cheap, right? I mean, they are not 60, 80 euro a ton of CO2, right? They are orders of magnitude less. So that means the economics of these two regulatory systems that exist next to each other shift the SAF into a usage where actually we do not have a net emission benefit, because these are emissions under the EU ETS where we have the cap. So that is a problem, and I don't think it is a problem that is enough in the discussion in the public sphere, I think, at this point. So that's why I wanted to point it out here also.
I absolutely agree, and this is why we are here together and actually recording this podcast. Actually, I think because really to highlight that kind of aspect, and I really think it's very interesting. What you said is that it actually, if you put it all together, then the incentives for using SAF within the EU or extra EU really going into would be going into the wrong direction. But also it shows actually that it's a policy decision. So the policy design could perhaps change so that it actually should be working in the right direction in a sense. I think I also thought it was very interesting what Stef mentioned with the hydro. So you need, in order to produce the eSAF, right? We know that until 2030, HEFA and these, SAF manufacturing procedures should be produce enough SAFs so we can achieve the quota goals in a sense. When it comes to the eSAF, there is much more uncertainty. And what you mentioned is that hydrogen is a big factor here. Because you need the hydrogen, which you can, and the carbon, capture carbon in order to produce the eSAF. And what you mentioned, Stef, is that the price will be very high. I think there is another issue which you mentioned in the very beginning of your slides, and this is China. So China has when it comes to photovoltaics, when it comes to wind energy, when it comes to hydro, all kinds of renewable energies, actually they have been very strong. And actually if you look at where most of the hydrogen is actually produced, also in China, of course, still to a large, it's not used on renewables, right? That's a problem. But the future is if we're talking about a situation in 5 or 6 years or maybe 10 years, things can change. So I think maybe that could be some push towards reducing the cost of also producing e-SAF or.
Yeah, but let's say in Europe, we're also thinking about Africa, okay, Qatar, whatever, and Belgium, as I think South Africa or whatever. There are many places where, in principle, you can have a lot of photovoltaics and also cheap hydrogen or cheaper hydrogen, let's put it this way. Then you still have to combine it with captured CO2 if you want to make SAF. And then, okay, you still have to transport it, etc., etc. So it could be that if hydrogen is used, economically, we'll probably have to wait until we have hydrogen propulsion of aircraft. So it could be very different route to use hydrogen than to use it via the SAF, via e-fuels, whatever. But okay, I'm not an expert on technology, so whenever I discuss with people in engineering, they are surprised and say, yes, it may be true. But I didn't see the demonstration, so it's not up to me.
Right.
So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think for the moment, I'm afraid we are just pushing a policy. And I know by experience that there was enormous. I worked for the European Commission on a project on biofuels or SAF for aviation. I think something like maybe 6-7 years ago. And at that time, there was a tremendous lobby of, I don't know, I'm not going to mention all the names, tremendous lobby to have this SAF, to have this refuel mandates in aviation sector. And I said, sorry, I don't understand because it's way too costly. But okay, it came true. It was decided because I think there's an enormous pressure also on the European Commission saying, you have to come up with a zero emission solution for aviation. Like they say, you have to come up with a zero emission solution for trucking, for maritime. And as we discussed, this is not the best way to go in terms of policy. You can, of course, always encourage R&D and say you have to point them in the right direction. But the main guidelines for me as a simple economist is to say it's still the price of ETS. It's ETS that will drive to a large extent, that should drive the efforts to develop new technologies. And what you do with SAF fuels, in the end, you point it in the direction of developing SAF. And if you imagine that you had a separate ETS for aviation, what you attenuate or what you reduce then is the prices of ETS. So it's actually also what we have seen in the electricity sector, where there's several papers that demonstrate that if you really put the emphasis on renewables and renewable portfolio, you have a policy that is 10 times more expensive than a policy that focuses on CO2. And the policy on CO2 is actually a policy that makes sure that we substituted coal by gas. That was the main element in, say, climate policy in Europe. And we tend to
I think
forget.
this is a good final words, right? Robert, do you have any
I'm not sure.
any final comments?
Yeah, well, as we economists, we do have a preference, right, for simple solution that trust the market, and I do understand where this is all coming from. I also understand, though, here the industry, and maybe that's my closing statement. Aviation is a lot of pressure to reduce emissions, and I think the allure of SAF is that it seems to promise a future in which we can still fly all fly a lot, right? There's still an aviation industry that employs people, right? Everybody is still traveling to Mallorca for the vacation, right? Happy customers. So essentially business of usual, right? By means of technology. So I understand where this is all coming from. I really do. I just think that we need a bit more realism with regard to what SAF can achieve and what the consequences also are. Because I'm not convinced, and I'm not unconvinced that we manage with the SAF scale up. I simply do not know. Right, what will happen. But either if the scale up does not happen, the emission reductions do not happen, or if the scale up happens, the emission reduction might happen, but then flying becomes much more expensive, right? And that is the reality, right? Because these SAFs are so expensive, and they will indeed remain more expensive for the foreseeable future, because where are all these cost reductions magically going to happen? It's not PV, right? Which is just based on the efficiency of the solar cell. The cost is completely different, right? It's essentially refining what we're talking about here. What are the efficiency gains you can make? How cheap can your resource be, your feedstock, right? It's all limited. So these SAF will remain more expensive. And that ultimately means that flying will become more expensive, which then means, well, people fly less. As economists, I don't have an issue with that, right? Because if the externality is what it is, yeah, then it has to be accounted for. But it is unrealistic to assume that we have successful SAF ramp up and no impact on the aviation market. There will be an impact.